Section 1. Hey guys. Tonight we are stepping back about 700 years, pulling on a rough linen tunic, and discovering what happened to your body when it decided to betray you in the middle of the medieval period. No antibiotics, no sterile gloves, no reassuring fluorescent waiting room with a little television playing daytime talk shows. Just you, a straw mattress, a very confident man holding a jar of your own urine up to the light, and the sincere belief that the stars may have caused your cough. You probably won't survive this, not because medieval people were incompetent, but because the line between a mild fever and a swift funeral was genuinely, terrifyingly thin, and the treatments designed to help you had an almost artistic talent for making things worse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I genuinely love seeing those roll in. Someone is always in a wildly unexpected time zone doing something they should not be doing at this hour. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in the year, let's say 1320, give or take a decade, because medieval time moves at its own unhurried pace and nobody is particularly precious about the exact date. You are somewhere in Western Europe. Maybe England, maybe France, maybe a modest town in the Rhine Valley where the streets smell of wood smoke and animal certainty and last Tuesday's bread. You have woken up this morning feeling wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not face down in the mud wrong, but that particular creeping wrongness that every human being across every century has recognized the moment they open their eyes. The scratchy throat, the joints that ache like something has been quietly tightening bolts inside them overnight, the faint but persistent suggestion that your body has lodged a formal complaint and is awaiting a response. Here is the thing, though. In 1320, your body is not just a body. It is a philosophical argument. It is a theological statement. It is a tiny, walking version of the entire cosmos, and when something goes wrong inside it, the explanation is both deeply personal and breathtakingly universal. To understand what being sick in medieval times was really like, you first have to understand how medieval people understood the human body itself, and that means spending a little time with four very important, very bossy, completely invisible fluids. The four humors. If there is one concept that underpins virtually everything about medieval medicine, it is this one. The theory was not medieval in origin. It came primarily from the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, and was later elaborated and systematized by Galen of Pergamon, a Roman-era physician whose writings became so dominant that they essentially ran Western medicine like a franchise for well over 1,000 years. When medieval scholars and physicians inherited this intellectual tradition, they did not question it so much as they decorated it, expanded it, wove it into theology, astrology, and diet, and applied it to every conceivable symptom with the kind of confident enthusiasm you might recognize today from people who have just discovered a particular wellness influencer on social media. The four humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each one was produced in a different organ: the liver, the brain, the gallbladder, the spleen. Each one had a corresponding season, a corresponding element, a corresponding set of personality traits, and a corresponding relationship to health and disease. Blood was warm and moist, associated with spring and air, and when it was dominant in a person, they were sanguine, cheerful, social, a little ruddy in the cheeks, the life of the feast. Phlegm was cold and moist, associated with winter and water, and a phlegmatic person was calm, slow-moving, perhaps a little damp around the edges in both the literal and metaphorical sense. Yellow bile was warm and dry, associated with summer and fire, and produced the choleric temperament, quick to anger, energetic, the kind of person who starts arguments about the proper way to sharpen a knife. Black bile was cold and dry, associated with autumn and earth, and gave you the melancholic temperament, thoughtful, anxious, prone to sitting by windows and thinking about mortality, which, in the 14th century, was at least a realistic hobby. Now, here is the crucial point. When all four humors existed in the right balance for your particular body, you were healthy. When that balance tipped, when one humor became excessive or another grew deficient, or the wrong humor accumulated in the wrong part of the body, you became ill. And this was not a random mechanical failure, the way we might think of a bacterial infection or a vitamin deficiency today. This was a disruption of order, cosmic misalignment. the universe expressing, through your feverish, aching body, that something had gone fundamentally out of tune. This framing matters enormously because it shapes everything that follows, every diagnosis, every treatment, every decision about what to eat or avoid, every reason your physician might recommend that you go stand in a specific direction while the moon is in a particular phase. Yes, we will get to that. There is so much to get to. The body, in this understanding, was not a machine to be fixed. It was a balance to be restored. And everything the medieval medical practitioner did, however alarming it looks to modern eyes, was oriented around that central goal of restoration, which is, when you think about it, not entirely different from what we are trying to do now. We have just changed our understanding of what exactly is out of balance and why. You are still lying there, though, feeling terrible. Your throat is genuinely unpleasant. Your forehead is warm in a way that suggests something is happening in there that you did not authorize. And your phlegm, and I apologize for bringing this up so early in our evening together, your phlegm has taken on a character and a presence that feels entirely disproportionate to the rest of you. In humoral terms, this is already telling a story. Excess phlegm flowing downward from the brain, which was thought to produce it, pooling in the chest and throat. This is a cold, moist imbalance. Your particular humoral configuration has tipped toward the phlegmatic. Something needs to warm you, dry you out, restore the equilibrium that your unruly body has abandoned. But before anyone can treat you, they need to understand exactly which humor is at fault, in which organ, to what degree, and why. The diagnosis, in other words, must come first. And the diagnostic methods available in 1320 are, well, we will get into those in exquisite detail later because they deserve their own space. For now, let's think about the broader picture of what illness meant in a society built around this humoral framework. One of the most important things to understand is that medieval people did not experience a sharp division between the physical and the spiritual when it came to sickness. This is something historians still discuss at considerable length. The question of how ordinary medieval laypeople actually integrated religious and medical explanations for illness, whether they saw them as competing or complementary, and whether the Church's framing of disease as spiritual consequence genuinely shaped how people felt about their own suffering. The answer, as best as we can reconstruct it from chronicles, wills, prayers, and medical texts, seems to be mostly complementary, usually layered, and very much dependent on the specific illness, the specific person, and the specific community. On one level, yes, illness could be understood as a consequence of sin, God sending affliction as correction, as a call to spiritual accounting, as a reminder of human frailty and divine power. The great plagues and epidemics of the period were often interpreted in this register, with mass outbreaks read as collective moral failures requiring collective penitential response. But at the individual level, for the everyday aching head or swollen joint or persistent cough, most medieval people seem to have moved fairly fluidly between the spiritual and the natural. You might pray and take your herbal remedy. You might visit the shrine and also consult the physician. You might interpret your illness as both a humoral imbalance and a gentle nudge from the Almighty, and see these not as contradictions but as two different ways of describing the same disruption. This integration runs so deep that even the most learned physicians of the period, men trained at the great universities of Bologna, Montpellier, Paris, and Oxford, operated within a framework that assumed divine creation and governance of the natural world. The humors were not arbitrary. They reflected the wisdom encoded into creation itself. The planets influenced the body not through superstition but through a sophisticated, if entirely wrong, theory of cosmic sympathy, the idea that the same principles that structured the heavens structured the human microcosm below. The sun ruled the heart. The moon ruled the brain. Saturn, cold and slow, governed the spleen and melancholy. Jupiter, warm and generous, supported the liver and blood. When a physician calculated the astrological conditions under which a patient fell ill, he was not indulging in magical thinking. He was doing, by his light's careful empirical work, reading the evidence of the cosmos for its bearing on the human body within it. There is something almost poignant about this, when you sit with it quietly enough. These were people, intelligent, curious, dedicated people, doing the absolute best they could with the explanatory tools available to them, trying to impose order on the terrifying randomness of disease, trying to find a system that was predictive and treatable rather than merely mysterious and fatal. The system they inherited was internally consistent, philosophically sophisticated, and, at the level of its core mechanism, completely mistaken. But the impulse behind it, the need to understand, to categorize, to find the cause and therefore the cure, is utterly recognizable. It is exactly what medicine is still doing today with different tools and, we hope, somewhat better outcomes. You, meanwhile, are pulling your rough woolen blanket up a little higher, because the draft coming under the door is doing your cold-moist imbalance absolutely no favors. The fire in the central hearth is sending smoke more or less in the direction of the smoke hole in the roof, with its characteristic medieval enthusiasm for also filling the room. Your wife, or your mother, or your neighbor, whoever has been pressed into the role of caretaker this morning, is bringing you something warm to drink. We will talk later about what that something warm actually is, because the medieval pharmacopoeia of hot beverages is both extensive and occasionally alarming. For now, you are sick. Your body has announced, through the ancient and universal language of misery, that something is wrong. And the entire intellectual, spiritual, and practical apparatus of your world is already mobilizing, in its own particular, fascinating, occasionally counterproductive way, to figure out what that something is. One quirky detail worth settling into your mind before we move on. Medieval physicians were not only interested in the state of your humors in abstract theory. They were also deeply attentive to what they called the six non-naturals, a set of external factors believed to directly influence humoral balance. These were air quality, food and drink, sleep and waking, exercise and rest, retention and evacuation, which covered everything from digestion to sweating to, yes, the timely release of various substances, and the passions of the soul, your emotional state. A physician treating you in 1320 might be just as interested in whether you had recently experienced intense grief or prolonged anger as in what you had eaten for supper. Emotional disturbance was not a psychological side note. It was a direct humoral event, as physically real and medically significant as a change in the weather or a night of poor sleep. This is, in a way that would have surprised no medieval physician but might surprise us, strikingly aligned with what modern psychoneuroimmunology has been demonstrating for the past few decades, that emotional states have measurable physiological consequences for immune function, inflammatory response, and overall health. The medieval physician had the mechanism entirely wrong, obviously. He thought grief produced excess black bile, which cooled and dried the body, which predisposed it to melancholic disease. We would describe the same relationship in terms of cortisol, cytokines, and hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysregulation. But both traditions are pointing at the same underlying reality, that the body and the emotional life are not separate systems, and that stress, grief, and fear have consequences for your physical health that are real, measurable, and medically relevant, which is, if nothing else, a reminder that being completely wrong about the mechanism does not mean being completely wrong about the observation. Medieval medicine made that error repeatedly in both directions, correct observations with wrong explanations, and wrong observations leading to treatments that somehow occasionally worked anyway. The history of medicine is full of this kind of accidental, crooked wisdom, and medieval Europe is one of its richest chapters. The fire crackles. The smoke drifts. Your blanket is scratchy and smells faintly of the animals who contributed their wool to it. And somewhere in this town, a man who has spent years studying Galen and Avicenna and the phases of the moon is, if you are lucky enough to be able to afford him, preparing to come and take a very close look at your urine. Tonight, we are going to follow that whole strange, earnest, sometimes horrifying, sometimes surprisingly wise journey. From the first symptom to the last remedy, from the physician's bag to the hospital bed to the shrine at the edge of town where the sick come to pray and sleep and hope. It is going to be a long night. But then again, in the medieval world, a long night was at least a night you had survived. Word count, 3,104. Awaiting, continue. Section 2. The town you are lying in, feverish, phlegmatic, and increasingly aware that your situation requires professional attention, is not short of people who will claim they can help you. This is both reassuring and deeply alarming, because the medieval medical landscape is less a tidy hierarchy of credentialed professionals and more a sprawling, overlapping, occasionally contradictory marketplace of healers, each with their own training, their own methods, their own fees, and their own particular brand of confidence that they know exactly what is wrong with you and exactly how to fix it. Navigating this landscape when you are healthy is confusing enough. Navigating it when you are feverish and your joints feel like they have been packed with wet sand is genuinely heroic. Let's start at the top of the theoretical hierarchy, because the medieval world loved a hierarchy almost as much as it loved a good purgative. At the pinnacle sat the university-trained physician, the medicus, the doctor of medicine, the man who had spent anywhere from 7 to 14 years at a university studying Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna's canon of medicine, Aristotelian natural philosophy, and the intricate dance of planets and humors. He could read Latin. He could read Arabic if he was particularly accomplished. He could debate the finer points of humoral theory with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he had not spent nearly enough time outdoors. He was, in the social imagination of the period, the pinnacle of medical authority. He was also, depending on where and when you lived, extremely difficult to access. University-trained physicians were expensive, urban, and relatively rare. They clustered in cities, in the courts of kings and bishops, in the households of wealthy merchants and nobles. If you were a prosperous townsperson in Paris or London or Bologna, you might plausibly get a physician to your bedside. If you were a peasant farmer in rural Lincolnshire or the Burgundian countryside, you might as well have written a very polite letter to the moon. The university physician was, for the majority of medieval people, a theoretical resource, the kind of help that existed somewhere in the world, just not conveniently near you when you needed it. What the physician actually did when he did come was primarily cognitive. This is an important distinction. He diagnosed, he theorized, he prescribed. He did not, as a rule, touch you very much, and he certainly did not use his hands to perform procedures on your body. That was somebody else's job entirely, and the division between those two categories, the thinking physician and the cutting surgeon, was one of the defining social and professional fault lines of medieval medicine. The physician considered manual work beneath his scholarly dignity, which is a position that becomes considerably less defensible when you remember that the manual workers in question were the ones actually doing something about your situation. However inadvisable that something might turn out to be. Which brings us to the barber surgeon. If the university physician was the intellectual aristocracy of medieval medicine, the barber surgeon was its working class, and in many practical ways its backbone. Barber surgeons learned their trade not through university study but through apprenticeship, watching and assisting a master, learning by doing, accumulating practical knowledge through direct experience with actual bodies in actual distress. They cut hair, they pulled teeth, they lanced abscesses, they set broken bones. They performed bloodletting, the most common medical intervention of the entire period, with a practiced efficiency that came from doing it several times a week. They amputated limbs when necessary, working fast because speed, in the absence of anesthesia, was the closest thing to mercy available. And yes, they cut hair, which seems like an odd combination until you remember that all of these activities shared the essential requirement of a sharp blade and a steady hand. The iconic red and white barber's pole, which you can still see outside barbershops today, is a direct descendant of this dual role. The red representing blood, the white representing the bandage, the pole itself representing the rod that patients gripped during bloodletting to encourage the veins to stand up. The next time you walk past a barbershop, you are walking past a small, cheerful monument to 1,000 years of people being bled in the chair where you get your haircut. Sleep on that. Historians still argue about the precise social and professional relationship between physicians and barber surgeons in different parts of medieval Europe, whether the divide was as sharp in practice as it was in theory, whether cooperation was more common than the formal hierarchies suggest, and how the relationship evolved differently in England, France, Italy, and the German territories. What seems clear is that in the lived experience of medieval illness, the barber surgeon was often the first and most accessible professional intervention available, and that dismissing their work as merely crude or barbaric misses the genuine skill and knowledge that the best of them accumulated over long careers. Below, or perhaps simply alongside, in a parallel economy that the formal medical hierarchy preferred not to acknowledge, sat the apothecary. The apothecary was the medieval pharmacist, the keeper of the remedy shop, the person who sourced, prepared, and dispensed the herbal and compound medicines that formed the bulk of day-to-day medical treatment. A good apothecary knew hundreds of plants, their properties, their seasons, their interactions. They imported exotic ingredients, spices, resins, minerals, from trade routes that stretched to the Middle East and beyond. They ground and mixed and measured with a precision that the casual observer might not expect from a shop that also smelled strongly of dried things and mysterious fermentation. The relationship between physician and apothecary was close, sometimes cooperative, sometimes deeply suspicious. The physician prescribed, the apothecary prepared and dispensed. In theory. In practice, apothecaries frequently offered their own diagnostic opinions and treatment suggestions to customers who came in without a physician's prescription, which the physicians found professionally irritating and the customers found practically convenient. The apothecary was cheaper and more accessible than the physician, available on the high street rather than at the end of an expensive house call, and willing to engage with your symptoms in a direct, practical way that the scholarly physician, wrapped in his theoretical dignity, sometimes was not. There was a joke that circulated in various forms throughout the medieval period, that the physician made you sick, the apothecary made you worse, and the surgeon finished you off, which, while unkind, reflects something real about the popular ambivalence toward professional medicine's track record. But we have not yet reached the most important healer in most medieval people's actual lives, the person to whom the majority of sick individuals turned first, before the physician, before the barber surgeon, before the apothecary, and sometimes instead of all three. That person was usually a woman. She might be called a wise woman, a herbalist, a midwife, a cunning woman. She lived in your village or your neighborhood. She knew the local plants and their uses. She had delivered most of the babies in the community and attended most of its deaths. She knew which remedies worked for a cough and which helped a child's fever break. She knew how to set a sprain and how to ease the pain of a tooth that needed pulling. And she charged, if she charged at all, considerably less than anyone with a Latin degree. The role of women in medieval medicine is one of those areas where the historical picture has been significantly revised over the past several decades. An older narrative, heavily shaped by later Renaissance and early modern sources, presented female healers primarily through the lens of witch trials and church suppression, as if the dominant story were one of persecution and marginalization. And yes, that persecution was real, particularly in the later medieval and early modern periods, and it was devastating for specific communities of women. But the fuller picture is considerably more complex. Women practiced medicine at every level of medieval society, as informal community healers, as nurses and carers in hospitals, as apothecaries in some regions, and, in at least some documented cases, as formally trained practitioners. The medical school at Salerno in southern Italy, one of the earliest and most influential in medieval Europe, was associated with a tradition of female medical practitioners, and a woman known as Trotta of Salerno may have authored or contributed to influential medical texts on women's health, though the precise extent of her authorship is something historians continue to debate with considerable energy. In the practical, daily landscape of medieval illness, then, you had options. Expensive, inaccessible, scholarly options at the top and cheap, local, experiential options at the base, with layers of barber surgeons, apothecaries, midwives, and community healers filling in the enormous middle. What you actually accessed depended almost entirely on your wealth, your location, your gender, the nature of your illness, and, let's be honest, your luck. Your gender mattered more than you might expect. The medical encounter in medieval Europe was complicated by assumptions about the appropriateness of a male physician examining a female patient. A learned male physician examining a woman's body, particularly her intimate body, was considered problematic by social convention in ways that could directly impede diagnosis and treatment. Women were often expected to describe their symptoms verbally to a male physician rather than submitting to physical examination, which introduced obvious limitations. For conditions involving reproduction, childbirth, and the female body's particular complaints, midwives and female healers were not merely a second-best option. They were the standard and expected resource, and often the most knowledgeable one available. Your wealth mattered in ways that go beyond the obvious. It was not only that rich people could afford physicians and poor people could not. It was also that the treatments prescribed by learned physicians, compound medicines involving imported spices, dietary regimens requiring access to particular foods, the recommendation to take the healing waters at a distant spa or make a pilgrimage to a shrine several weeks' travel away, were embedded in a framework of privilege that assumed a certain quality of material life. When a physician recommended that a patient eat light, easily digestible foods, avoid strenuous labor, and rest in a warm, well-ventilated room. He was prescribing for an imagined patient who had a warm, well-ventilated room, who could afford light and easily digestible foods, and who did not have a harvest to bring in or a lord's demands to meet regardless of personal health. The medieval peasant experiencing the same illness received the same theoretical advice and faced a completely different practical reality. There is also a healer we have not mentioned yet, and who operates in a category that cuts across all the others, the saint. Not a healer you consult in the conventional sense, not someone who prescribes or diagnoses, but a presence, a power, an intercessory force whose favor you cultivate through prayer, pilgrimage, and devotion. We will spend much more time with saints and shrines and the hospital as holy space in a later section of our journey tonight. But it is worth noting here, when we are mapping the landscape of medieval healers, that for most medieval people the saint was not a last resort, not the desperate option you turned to when everything else had failed. The saint was woven into the medical response from the very beginning, as naturally as you might today both take your medication and try to get enough sleep. Not either slash or, but both, because you are working on the problem from multiple directions simultaneously. One more figure deserves a brief appearance in this already crowded room. The astrologer-physician, or simply the physician who incorporated astrological calculation into his practice, which in the high and late medieval period was most of them. This is not a fringe character but a central one. The idea that the position of the planets at the time of a patient's birth, or at the time they fell ill, or at the time a proposed treatment was to be administered, had direct bearing on the outcome. This was not superstition in the pejorative sense, but a carefully developed theoretical system with its own internal logic, its own textual tradition, and its own practitioners who had spent years learning to calculate and interpret. A physician deciding whether to perform bloodletting would genuinely consider the phase of the moon. A surgeon timing an operation would calculate whether the planetary conditions were propitious. This was considered not merely acceptable but responsible. The failure to take astrological factors into account was a mark of negligence, not sophistication. The quirky detail that really captures the flavor of this is that some physicians carried, or at minimum consulted, a device called a volvel, a kind of rotating paper or vellum calculator that could be used to quickly determine astrological correspondences relevant to medical decisions. Imagine your doctor pulling out what looked like an elaborate cardboard disc, spinning some concentric rings, and then nodding slowly before telling you whether your kidneys were currently under favorable celestial influence. Alarming, certainly, but also, in its way, a reminder that the instinct to reach for a systematic tool to impose order on uncertain medical decision-making is timeless. The volvel is just a very old and very wrong kind of diagnostic algorithm. So there you are, in your rough linen and your fever, surrounded by this complex, stratified, overlapping ecosystem of people who might help you. The question of which one you actually see depends on 100 contingencies: social, financial, geographical, gendered. But whoever comes through your door or whatever market stall or church porch you drag yourself to, the first thing they are going to want to do is figure out what is wrong with you. And the methods they are going to use to answer that question are, by turns, ingenious, logical, deeply strange, and occasionally involving a small glass of your own urine being held up to a window and sniffed, which is exactly where we are going next. Word count, 3,121. Awaiting, continue. Section 3. The physician arrives at your door, or you have dragged yourself, wrapped in your cloak and your misery, to wherever he receives patients. And the first thing he does, before he touches you, before he asks you a single question about how you feel, is look. Just look. He stands at a slight distance and observes you with the practiced, assessing gaze of someone who has been trained to read the human body the way a scholar reads a manuscript. Every detail a potential clue, every deviation from the ideal a word in the sentence that spells out your diagnosis. The color of your face, the way you hold yourself, whether your eyes are bright or dull, whether your skin has taken on any unusual tint, whether you are sweating or dry, flushed or pale, restless or unnaturally still. All of this is data. All of this is being processed, categorized, and filed against the humoral framework that structures everything he knows about the human body. This initial visual assessment is not as primitive as it might sound. Modern physicians still do something similar, The practiced clinical eye that takes in a patient's overall presentation before a single diagnostic test is run is a genuine medical skill. And experienced doctors will tell you that they often form an initial impression of severity and likely diagnosis from that first observational moment that subsequent testing frequently confirms. The difference is that the medieval physician's observational framework was built on humoral theory rather than on the physiology and pathophysiology we recognize today. He was watching for the same things: color, posture, alertness, the quality of breathing, but interpreting what he saw through a completely different explanatory lens. He saw a pale, cold, slow patient and thought, excess phlegm. We see the same patient and think, possible anemia, hypothyroidism, low blood pressure, shock. The observation is similar. The explanation is worlds apart. But the visual examination is only the beginning. Because medieval diagnosis was a multisensory, multisystemic enterprise that drew on every available channel of information, and some channels that we would not, today, consider information channels at all. Let's work through them, because the full diagnostic encounter of a medieval physician is one of those things that is simultaneously more sophisticated and more baffling than you might expect, sometimes within the same sentence. The pulse was one of the primary diagnostic tools, and its use represents one of the more genuinely sophisticated threads in medieval medicine. The theory of pulse diagnosis came largely from Galen, who had developed an extraordinarily elaborate system for classifying different pulse qualities. Not merely fast or slow, strong or weak, but a taxonomy of rhythms, tensions, sizes, and intervals that Galen described in terms so minute and so finely graded that later physicians spent centuries arguing about whether it was even possible for human fingers to reliably detect the distinctions he claimed to be making. The pulse could be, in Galenic terminology, undulating, vermicular, gazelle-like, or ant-like, each quality supposedly indicating a specific humoral state in a specific organ. Whether medieval physicians actually applied this full taxonomy in daily practice, or whether they simplified it considerably for clinical use, is something historians of medicine continue to discuss. What is clear is that taking the pulse, carefully at the wrist, with fingers positioned just so, for an extended period, was a standard and central part of the diagnostic encounter, and that a physician who could not read a pulse was considered poorly trained. There was also, famously, the practice of uroscopy, the examination of urine, and if you came away from our introduction last time with the image of a man holding a small glass of urine up to the light, you were not wrong, but you were getting only a fraction of the story. Uroscopy was not a casual glance. It was a systematic, theoretically grounded diagnostic practice with its own dedicated literature, its own instruments, and its own classification systems that rivaled the pulse taxonomy in complexity and ambition. The urine flask, the metulla, was a standardized glass vessel whose shape allowed the physician to examine different layers of the urine, since the sediment, the middle body, and the surface foam were each believed to correspond to different organs and different humoral conditions in a kind of vertical map of the body's interior state. The physician examined urine for color, and the color wheel used in medieval uroscopy ran through roughly 20 distinct shades, from the near-transparent white of excessive cold and moisture through the various yellows and oranges and reds of increasing heat to the alarming dark browns and blacks that indicated serious imbalance or approaching death. He examined it for consistency. Was it thick or thin, cloudy or clear? He looked for suspended particles, for surface foam, for the character of any sediment that settled at the bottom. In some traditions, he smelled it. In some, he tasted it, a practice that is, by modern standards, inadvisable but which did occasionally yield genuinely diagnostic information, since the sweetness of diabetic urine is detectable by taste and was noted in medieval texts, even if its meaning was interpreted entirely differently. The urine wheel, the rotauroscopy, was a visual reference tool, a circular diagram that mapped urine colors to diagnosis, sometimes with astrological and seasonal correlations added in for good measure. A physician might carry one, or have one painted on the wall of his consulting room, or refer to a copy in one of his medical texts. It was, in its way, a diagnostic algorithm, a systematic decision tree for moving from observation to conclusion. The algorithm was wrong in its underlying theory, but the impulse to systematize the leap from observation to diagnosis is entirely recognizable. Here is the quirky detail that the history of uroscopy tends to produce in anyone who looks closely enough. The practice became so culturally prominent that by the later medieval period, the image of the physician holding up a urine flask had become almost a visual shorthand for medicine itself, the way we might use a stethoscope today. And this prominence led, inevitably, to abuse. Charlatans set up what contemporaries called piss prophets or watercasters, practitioners who claimed, on the basis of urine alone, to diagnose any condition, often without ever seeing the patient, sometimes examining urine that had been sent from a considerable distance in a sealed flask. The legitimate physicians were appalled, writing furiously against these frauds, insisting that uroscopy was only one part of a complete diagnostic encounter and that claiming to know everything from a jar of urine was dangerous nonsense. Which is, again, a reminder that the impulse to exploit medical authority for profit and the impulse of legitimate practitioners to police that exploitation are not modern inventions. Beyond the pulse and the urine, the physician had several other diagnostic tools at his disposal. The examination of the eyes, their color, their clarity, the appearance of the whites and the pupils, provided information about the liver and the overall state of the blood. The skin's color, texture, and temperature told stories about the balance of heat and moisture in the body. The character of any visible swellings, sores, or eruptions on the skin's surface was read as a map of internal disturbance finding its way outward. The tongue, when examined, revealed the state of digestion and the condition of the stomach. Even the patient's breath, its smell, its character, was diagnostic, since certain diseases were thought to produce specific breath odors as the corrupted humors expressed themselves through the lungs. The patient's own account of their symptoms mattered too, though in a somewhat different way than a modern clinical history. The physician listened to the patient's report of their pain, its location, its quality, its timing, but he was listening through the filter of humoral theory, translating the patient's experiential language into the theoretical categories he needed to form a diagnosis. If you told him your pain was burning and sharp, he heard heat and dryness, likely yellow bile involvement. If you described a heavy, dull aching, he heard coldness and moisture, phlegmatic or melancholic. The patient's subjective experience was real evidence, but it was evidence that needed theoretical translation to become medically useful. And then there was astrology. We touched on this earlier, the physician's use of planetary positions in medical decision-making. But in the context of diagnosis, it deserves a closer look, because the astrological dimension was not merely an add-on or an afterthought. It was structurally integrated into the diagnostic process in a way that affected timing, interpretation, and prognosis. The physician who came to your bedside would want to know not only your current symptoms but the astrological conditions under which you had fallen ill. Was the moon waxing or waning? Which sign was it in? Which planet was in the ascendant? These questions were not decorative. They were believed to directly influence which organ was vulnerable, which humor was likely to be in excess, and how the illness would progress. The concept of critical days is particularly interesting here. Based on theories derived from both Hippocratic and Galenic medicine, medieval physicians believed that the course of an acute illness followed a predictable rhythm tied to the lunar cycle, with certain days, the 4th, 7th, 9th, 11th, and 14th days of illness being among the most commonly cited, representing moments of crisis at which the body would either overcome the disease or be overcome by it. Monitoring a patient through these critical days, predicting which would be decisive, and timing treatments to coincide with favorable moments in the cycle, was a significant part of the physician's art. Whether these critical days reflected any real underlying biological rhythms, or whether they were entirely theoretical impositions on the messy reality of disease progression, is something that modern medical historians find genuinely interesting. There is some evidence that certain infectious diseases do follow roughly weekly cycles of symptom intensity, though for reasons that have nothing to do with the moon. One of the more fascinating aspects of the medieval diagnostic encounter is the role of prognosis, the prediction of how the illness would unfold, which in some ways was considered as important as, or even more important than, diagnosis in the modern sense. A physician who could accurately predict the course of an illness demonstrated his mastery of the underlying theory, his ability to read the subtle signs of nature's progress. And prognosis served a deeply practical social function. It told the patient and the family whether to prepare for recovery or for death, whether to summon the priest or the surgeon, whether the illness was at its crisis point or still building toward it. Getting prognosis right was, in a world without many effective treatments, sometimes the most useful thing a physician could actually do. The examination might also include what we would recognize as a rudimentary physical assessment, the physician pressing gently on the abdomen to detect pain or swelling, examining the lymph nodes in the neck and armpits, observing the pattern of breathing. These more direct physical examinations sat somewhat awkwardly within the theoretical framework, since the learned tradition emphasized cognitive diagnosis over manual investigation. But in practice, many physicians clearly did lay hands on their patients, at least partially, and used what they found to supplement the pulse and urine and astrological analysis. After all of this, the looking, the pulse reading, the urine examination, the astrological calculation, the patient history, the physician would form his diagnosis. Not a diagnosis in the modern sense of a named disease entity with a known cause and a specific treatment protocol, but a characterization of the humoral imbalance at work, which humor was in excess in which part of the body, to what degree, modified by the patient's individual constitution, their natural temperament, their age, their sex, their habitual lifestyle, and set against the astrological and seasonal context. From this characterization, the treatment would follow logically, because if you knew what was out of balance, you knew you needed to restore balance, and if you knew what quality was excessive, you knew you needed to apply its opposite. This is the beautiful, terrible elegance of humoral medicine. It was internally consistent in a way that made it feel reliable. If you had too much heat, you applied cooling remedies. If you had too much moisture, you applied drying ones. If excess humor had accumulated, it needed to be evacuated through bleeding, purging, sweating, or other means we will explore in considerable detail shortly. The logic was clear. The steps followed from each other in a satisfying chain of reasoning. The only problem was that the foundational premises were wrong, which meant that the elegant logical chain led you reliably to conclusions that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. But here is the thing, and this is worth sitting with as you let your eyes grow heavy. Medieval physicians were not entirely without empirical correctives. They observed their patients. They noticed which treatments seemed to help and which seemed to make things worse. They accumulated case histories and compared notes. The best of them were genuinely careful, thoughtful observers of the natural world, and they modified their theoretical frameworks, however slowly and reluctantly, in response to what they saw. The problem was not that they did not look. The problem was that they looked through glasses ground to a prescription written by Galen 1,000 years earlier, and changing those lenses required dismantling an intellectual tradition so deeply embedded in the educational, social, and institutional fabric of their world that it could not be shifted by any single observation, however clear. You are still being observed, still being assessed, still being read like a manuscript by careful eyes trained to see what they expect to see. The diagnosis is forming, and soon, very soon, someone is going to recommend a treatment. Something warm, perhaps, to address your cold-moist imbalance. Something drying. Something that will restore the balance your complaining body has so inconveniently abandoned. Something involving, quite possibly, a very sharp little knife. Word count, 3048. Awaiting, continue. Section 4. The remedy, when it comes, will almost certainly begin with a plant. This is not a small thing. Before the knife is sharpened, before the bleeding bowl is fetched, before any of the more dramatic interventions that medieval medicine has become famous for in the popular imagination, the first line of response to almost any illness in the medieval world is botanical. Herbal medicine is not the primitive predecessor to real medicine in this world. It is real medicine, the dominant form of it, the most widely practiced, the most extensively documented, the most deeply embedded in both learned theory and everyday domestic life. The garden, the hedgerow, the dried bundle hanging from the kitchen rafter, the carefully labeled jar on the apothecary's shelf. These are the medieval pharmacy, and they are considerably more sophisticated than the word herbal remedy tends to suggest to a modern ear trained to associate that phrase with unregulated supplements and optimistic packaging claims. Let's walk through what that pharmacy actually looked like, because the picture is worth building carefully. At the most domestic level, the level accessible to virtually everyone regardless of wealth or location, there was the household garden. Medieval domestic gardens, where they existed, were not primarily ornamental. They were functional, productive, carefully tended collections of plants chosen for their culinary and medicinal properties, often intermingled because the distinction between food and medicine was considerably less sharp in medieval thinking than it is in ours. Garlic, onions, leeks, these were food, yes, but also powerful medicinal agents with recognized effects on digestion, infection, and respiratory complaints. Mint settled the stomach and cleared the head. Sage, whose Latin name salvia derives from the word for health or salvation, was considered so broadly beneficial that a common medieval proverb asked why a man should die who had sage in his garden. A question that sounds rhetorical but was, in context, genuinely meant. Feverfew was used for fevers and headaches. Chamomile soothed and calmed. Lavender sweetened the air and eased anxiety. These were not folk beliefs operating at the margins of the medical system. They were standard recommendations in the learned medical texts of the period, grounded in humoral theory and endorsed by Galen and his successors. The theoretical framework through which herbal medicine operated was the doctrine of qualities, the same qualities that defined the humors themselves. Every plant had a characteristic combination of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness, and these qualities could be used to counteract the humoral imbalance causing the illness. Pepper was hot and dry. Cucumber was cold and moist. Willow bark, and here is one of the places where medieval medicine stumbled accidentally into genuine efficacy, was considered cold and somewhat bitter, useful for fevers and inflammatory conditions. Willow bark contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, which is the active principle behind aspirin. Medieval physicians recommending willow bark for fever were recommending it for the wrong reasons. They thought its cold quality counteracted the excessive heat of fever, but they were recommending something that actually worked, guided to the right answer by the wrong map. This pattern, correct treatment, incorrect theory, appears repeatedly in the medieval herbal tradition, and it has led to a genuine and ongoing conversation among historians and pharmacologists about how to evaluate pre-modern medicine fairly. Some of what medieval herbalists used has turned out to have real pharmacological activity. Foxglove, used in various preparations, contains digitalis glycosides, the basis of modern heart medications, though the medieval dose was wildly imprecise and often toxic. Opium poppy preparations were used for pain relief and sleep, and worked, for reasons that medieval physicians explained in terms of cold and moist qualities suppressing the vital spirits. Certain mold-contaminated bread preparations may have had antibiotic properties, though whether this was recognized or merely accidental is unclear. The point is not that medieval herbal medicine was secretly modern, it was not, and its failures were real and sometimes fatal. The point is that 1,000 years of careful observation of which plants seemed to help which conditions had accumulated a body of practical knowledge that was not worthless simply because the theoretical explanation for it was wrong. The most important written resource for medieval herbal medicine was the Herbarium, the Herbal, a text describing plants, their properties, their preparations, and their uses. The tradition stretched back to ancient Greek and Roman sources, particularly Dioscorides, whose first-century pharmacological text De Materia Medica was translated, copied, expanded, and circulated throughout the medieval period with the kind of dedicated attention usually reserved for sacred scripture. Medieval herbals were not merely practical recipe books, they were theoretical documents, situating each plant within the humoral framework, explaining why it worked as well as what it worked for, and sometimes including astrological information about the best time to harvest particular plants for maximum potency. The herbals were also, and this is worth noting because it adds a human texture to the botanical tradition, beautifully illustrated. The great medieval herbals contain some of the most striking plant illustrations of the pre-modern period, careful, detailed, sometimes surprisingly accurate drawings of plants in their recognizable forms, annotated with their names in multiple languages and their medical applications. These illustrations were not decorative. They were diagnostic aids, helping practitioners identify plants correctly, since misidentification was a genuine and sometimes fatal risk in a tradition where many useful plants had close relatives that were toxic. The illustrated herbal was a working document, handled and consulted, worn at the edges, annotated in the margins by generations of practitioners who added their own observations to the accumulated wisdom of the tradition. Beyond the household garden and the herbal tradition, the more complex preparations, the compound medicines that formed a significant part of the physician's and apothecary's practice, required ingredients that went considerably beyond what grew in local soil. The spice trade was not merely a culinary phenomenon in medieval Europe, it was a medical necessity. The exotic spices that arrived from the east, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, saffron, were as important to the apothecary as to the cook, and their expense reflected both their distance and their perceived medical value. These were hot, dry substances, useful for countering cold and moist imbalances, warming the stomach, stimulating digestion, expelling excess phlegm. A compound medicine called theriac, an elaborate preparation with dozens of ingredients that was considered a universal antidote and general fortifier, required ingredients from across the known world and was produced by specialist apothecaries in major cities, sold at considerable cost, and considered one of the most powerful and prestigious remedies available. Theriac has a history so strange and so long that it deserves a moment of attention on its own. Originally developed in the ancient world as an antidote to snake venom, the name derives from the Greek word for wild beast. It evolved over the centuries into an increasingly elaborate compound medicine containing anywhere from 30 to 80 or more ingredients, including viper flesh, which was considered essential to its antidotal properties. The production of theriac was a public event in some major medieval cities. The apothecaries would prepare it ceremonially, with witnesses to guarantee its authenticity, because the reputation and the price of the product were both high enough to make fraud tempting. Theriac was given for poisoning, for plague, for fevers, for almost any serious condition, and it was exported across Europe and the Mediterranean world in sealed jars with the producing city's seal. Whether it actually did anything beneficial is largely unclear, though some of its botanical ingredients had genuine pharmacological activity and the viper flesh, processed and dried, was essentially inert. The apothecary's shop was where most people without access to a physician actually obtained their medical care, and the range of what was available there went well beyond simple dried herbs. The apothecary worked with minerals, sulfur, mercury, iron compounds, various salts, as well as botanical preparations, animal products, and imported exotics. They prepared medicines in multiple forms, decoctions boiled from plant material and water, infusions steeped in water or wine, poultices applied externally to the skin, plasters that hardened over wounds or painful areas, oils infused with medicinal plants, electuaries, medicines mixed with honey or syrup for palatability, and pills, which were sometimes enormous by modern standards, since rolling a pill by hand produces a very different product from a pharmaceutical tableting machine. Wine was a crucial vehicle for many medicines, not merely because medieval people liked wine, though they did and drank it in quantities that would alarm a modern general practitioner, but because wine was considered medicinally warm and was believed to enhance the penetration and action of dissolved medicinal substances. A remedy dissolved in wine would, in theory, carry its medicinal quality more effectively into the body's tissues than the same remedy in water. The practical result was that a significant proportion of medieval medicines tasted of wine, which is the kind of therapeutic serendipity that is hard to argue with entirely. Water, however, plain drinking water, was regarded with considerable suspicion. This suspicion was not, in the humoral framework, irrational. Water was cold and moist, liable to introduce dangerous cold and moisture into the body, and likely to corrupt easily in the warm temperatures of summer. The medieval preference for wine, ale, or other fermented beverages over plain water was partly cultural and partly theoretical, but it was also accidentally correct in a way that medieval physicians could not have known. Fermenting beverages are considerably safer to drink than untreated water from medieval water sources, which were frequently contaminated with the runoff from privies, animal husbandry, and all the other waste products of dense human settlement. The physician who recommended his patients drink good wine rather than cold water was giving advice that, for the wrong reasons entirely, was frequently better for their immediate health than the alternative. Dietary advice formed a substantial part of the physician's prescription, because in humoral medicine food was medicine, everything you ate and drank directly affected your humoral balance, and a carefully managed diet was both a treatment for existing imbalance and a preventive measure against future illness. The 6 non-naturals we mentioned earlier, those external factors believed to influence humoral balance, placed food and drink at the center of medical management. A physician treating your cold-moist imbalance would prescribe not only herbal remedies but a dietary regimen, warming, drying foods to counteract your excess phlegm, avoidance of cold, moist foods that would aggravate it. Chicken broth, warming, easily digestible, gentle on a compromised system, was a standard prescription for the feverish and the weak. You will note that chicken broth is still what your grandmother recommends when you are ill, and that modern research has found genuine anti-inflammatory properties in properly made chicken stock. Some things travel across the centuries with remarkable persistence. Garlic deserves a specific mention here, because the medieval medical tradition was absolutely correct about garlic in ways that are increasingly validated by modern research. Garlic was considered hot and dry in the 3rd or 4th degree, which is to say extremely warming and drying, a powerful remedy for cold moist conditions, useful against excess phlegm, against chills, against intestinal worms, against infected wounds. Modern pharmacology has confirmed that garlic contains allicin and related compounds with genuine antimicrobial, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory properties. The medieval physician pressing garlic on a patient with a chest infection, a wound showing signs of corruption, or a parasitic infestation was being guided to the right intervention by the wrong theory, but the intervention was right. Garlic works. It worked then. It works now. The explanation has changed. The garlic has not. Historians still argue about how to draw the line between the learned herbal tradition and the folk or popular tradition of plant medicine that operated largely outside the textual record, whether they were genuinely distinct systems with different principles, or whether they were more continuous than the textual evidence suggests, with learned and popular practice sharing a common practical core even when their theoretical justifications differed. The honest answer is probably that the relationship varied enormously by region, by period, by the specific plants and conditions involved, and that the sharp distinction between learned medicine and folk medicine, like most sharp distinctions in history, dissolves when you look closely enough. What does not dissolve is the fundamental reality that for most medieval people, most of the time, the first and most accessible medical response to illness was botanical. Before the bloodletting, before the purge, before the pilgrimage, there was the herb, the garden, the dried bundle, the apothecary's jar, the hot decoction pressed into your hands by someone who had watched their own mother and grandmother do the same, reaching back in an unbroken chain of practical botanical knowledge that preceded Galen and would outlast him by centuries. Your warm drink is cooling slightly in the cup beside you. It smells of something green and faintly bitter, sage, perhaps, or a mixture of several things, honey sweetened to make it bearable. Outside, the apothecary's shop is shuttered for the evening, its dried herbs and mysterious powders waiting in their labeled jars for the morning's patients. The garden outside the monastery wall holds its quiet inventory of healing plants, damp with evening. The physician, however, has not finished with you. The herbs may warm and dry you, but if your imbalance is severe enough, if the excess humor has accumulated beyond what diet and herbs alone can address, then something more direct is going to be required. Something that will remove the problem rather than merely counteracting it. Something that will reach into your body and pull the corrupted excess out. Get ready. The bleeding bowl is coming. Word count, 3089. Awaiting, continue. Section 5. The bleeding bowl is a modest thing when you finally see it. A shallow ceramic or metal dish, wide enough to catch a reasonable volume without spillage, curved edges practical rather than decorative, the kind of object that looks entirely unremarkable until you understand its purpose and then becomes one of those items that the eye keeps returning to with a mixture of fascination and profound personal reluctance. It sits on the small table beside your bed with the calm, patient energy of something that knows its role and has played it many times before. The barber surgeon who has brought it sets it down without ceremony. He has done this hundreds of times. He will do it hundreds more. To him, this is Tuesday. To you, lying there with your fever and your humoral imbalance and your growing suspicion that the next several minutes are not going to improve your afternoon, this is considerably more than Tuesday. Bloodletting, phlebotomy, as the learned tradition called it, was the single most commonly performed medical procedure in medieval Europe. Not the most dramatic, not the most dangerous, though it had its moments on both those fronts, but the most routine, the most universally recommended, the most deeply embedded in both the theory and the practice of medieval medicine across every social level from the peasant to the king. Kings were bled. Monks were bled on a regular seasonal schedule as a matter of institutional health maintenance. Pregnant women were bled, which is among the more alarming applications of the practice. Healthy people were bled preventively to maintain their humoral balance before imbalance could take hold. The question in medieval medical practice was rarely whether bloodletting was appropriate. It was almost always considered appropriate for something, but rather when, where, how much, and from which vein. The theoretical justification was straightforward and followed impeccably from humoral premises. Blood was the dominant humor, the one most likely to be in excess, the one whose surplus caused a wide range of fevers, inflammations, and acute conditions. When blood was excessive, when it had accumulated beyond what the body needed, when it had become corrupted or overheated, the logical remedy was to remove some of it. Not all of it, obviously. The physician was not trying to kill you. He was trying to reduce the excess, to bring the quantity and quality of blood back into the range that your particular constitution required for health. This was, in theory, a precise and carefully calibrated intervention. In practice, it was often a somewhat approximate one, because determining exactly how much blood to remove was an art rather than a science, guided by the patient's apparent response, their color, their pulse, and the physician's experience, which is to say, by a combination of genuine observation and educated guesswork. The veins from which blood was drawn were carefully specified by the textual tradition, and the choice of vein was not arbitrary. Different veins were believed to have different relationships to different organs and different parts of the body, so that bleeding from a specific vein would draw excess blood or corrupt humor away from the organ or region that was affected. The cephalic vein in the arm was used for conditions of the head and chest. The median vein was considered particularly useful for liver and stomach conditions. The veins of the foot and ankle were used for lower body conditions and for gynecological complaints, which meant, awkwardly, that conditions of the womb were sometimes treated by bleeding from the foot, on the theory that drawing blood downward and outward would relieve congestion in the pelvic region. The logic was anatomically inventive. Whether it produced the intended result is another matter entirely. Astrological timing mattered enormously here. Remember the physician's volvel, spinning its concentric rings to check the planetary conditions. The moon's position in the zodiac was particularly important for bloodletting decisions, since each sign of the zodiac was associated with a specific part of the body, and bleeding from a vein connected to a body part currently under its associated zodiacal sign was considered dangerous, liable to cause excessive bleeding or wound complications. The waxing moon was generally considered a better time for bloodletting than the waning moon, since the humors were believed to be fuller and more accessible when the moon was growing. These considerations were not treated as optional refinements by careful practitioners. They were considered essential safeguards, and a barber surgeon who ignored them was considered to be practicing negligently. The fact that lunar phase has no demonstrable effect on bleeding outcomes did not, obviously, register in a world that had no way to run the controlled trial that would demonstrate it. The actual technique involved making an incision into the selected vein with a lancet, a small, sharp blade, and allowing blood to flow into the bowl until the practitioner judged that enough had been removed. The patient was expected to hold the arm steady, to breathe normally, and to report if they felt faint, since fainting was the body's eloquent way of indicating that the procedure had perhaps been somewhat enthusiastic. The wound was then bound with a cloth, the patient was advised to rest, and the removed blood was sometimes examined for its character, thick or thin, bright or dark, coagulating quickly or slowly, to provide additional diagnostic information. A good bloodletting, performed correctly on the right vein at the right time in the right amount, was considered not merely safe but actively beneficial, a restoration of balance rather than a depletion of resource. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge something that sits uncomfortably in the modern mind. Some people almost certainly felt better after bloodletting, at least temporarily, and this genuine subjective improvement helped maintain the practice's credibility across centuries. The reasons for this are not mysterious. Removing a significant volume of blood lowers blood pressure, which produces a sensation of calm and relaxation. In genuine cases of iron overload or polycythemia vera, conditions in which the blood is pathologically thickened, therapeutic phlebotomy is still used today, and it genuinely works. The placebo effect of a confident, authoritative intervention, performed in the context of a coherent medical theory, by a practitioner who clearly knows what they are doing, is real and measurable. None of this means bloodletting was generally beneficial. It was frequently harmful, occasionally fatal, and contributed to the deaths of people who would have recovered from their underlying illness if left alone. But the practice was not sustained purely by ignorance and credulity. It was sustained partly by genuine, if misleading, feedback. If bloodletting was the most common intervention, cupping was its close companion and frequent supplement. Cupping involved applying heated glass or metal cups to the skin, the heat creating a partial vacuum as it cooled, which drew the skin upward into the cup and was believed to draw corrupt humors toward the surface of the body where they could be expelled. Dry cupping left bruises but did not break the skin. Wet cupping involved first scarifying the skin with small cuts, then applying the cups to draw blood and humors out through the surface. The marks left by cupping, those distinctive circular bruises, are still visible on athletes and celebrities today who have adopted the practice as a wellness treatment, which puts you in the interesting historical position of living simultaneously in a world that has mapped the human genome and a world that is enthusiastically applying an ancient technique for balancing the humors of people who do not believe in humors. History contains multitudes. Purging was the other great pillar of the evacuative tradition, and it operated on the same basic principle as bloodletting, the excess or corrupt humor needed to be removed from the body, but through a different route. Purgative medicines were designed to stimulate vigorous emptying of the bowels, expelling what the theory held to be accumulated yellow or black bile along with whatever else happened to be in the digestive system at the time. The purgatives available to medieval practitioners ranged from the relatively gentle figs, prunes, and certain herbal preparations, to the extremely forceful, including preparations based on hellebore, scammony, and various other botanical substances whose laxative properties were so aggressive that they could cause severe dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and genuine danger to already weakened patients. The prescription of purging required, in theory, careful calibration to the patient's constitution and the nature of their imbalance. A robust, well-nourished patient could tolerate a strong purgative. A frail, elderly, or depleted one required something gentler. The wrong purgative for the wrong patient was recognized, even within the system, as potentially fatal. The problem was that the diagnostic assessment of which humor needed purging, and in what quantity, was subject to all the same theoretical uncertainties as any other medieval diagnosis, which meant that the careful calibration was built on a foundation of guesswork dressed as precision. Patients were purged when they should not have been, purged too aggressively for their condition, purged of the wrong humor, purged in combination with bloodletting in a double evacuation that left them so depleted that recovering from the treatment became as significant a challenge as recovering from the original illness. Emetics, medicines designed to induce vomiting, operated on the same evacuative principle, aimed at expelling corrupt matter from the stomach and upper digestive tract. Enemas were used for lower digestive evacuation and for introducing medicinal substances into the body through a route that bypassed the stomach, which was considered useful when the stomach itself was compromised. The range of substances introduced via enema in medieval medical practice is, let us say, extensive and occasionally surprising, and we will leave most of it decorously to the imagination while noting that the theoretical rationale for each was perfectly coherent within its own framework. Sweating cures deserve mention as a somewhat gentler evacuative approach, though they had their own risks. Inducing perspiration was believed to expel corrupt humors through the skin, and the methods employed included hot baths, steam, heavy blankets, warming medicines and spices, and in some cases elaborate sweat houses or heated chambers. The bath itself had an ambiguous status in medieval medicine. The learned tradition generally supported bathing as therapeutic when properly managed, but popular belief in some periods and regions associated bathing with health risks, particularly the idea that hot water opened the pores to dangerous miasmas or cold air. The result was a complicated cultural negotiation around bathing practices that varied considerably by region, social class, and period, and that has been somewhat simplified by the popular notion that medieval people never bathed, which is not accurate but captures something real about the ambivalence surrounding the practice. What is fascinating about all of these interventions, the bloodletting, the cupping, the purging, the sweating, when you look at them together, is the underlying unity of their logic. They are all doing the same thing, attempting to remove something from the body that the body does not need or cannot use, in order to restore the internal balance that health requires. The theory of what that excess is, where it comes from, and how it causes disease is wrong. But the intuition that disease sometimes involves the body accumulating something it needs to expel, that recovery sometimes requires assistance with that expulsion, is not entirely without foundation. Modern medicine does, in fact, sometimes remove things from the body to restore health. We drain abscesses. We give diuretics to reduce fluid overload. We use dialysis to remove waste products the kidneys cannot clear. We administer laxatives for genuine constipation-related pathology. We even, as noted, still perform therapeutic phlebotomy for specific conditions. The mechanism and the indication are entirely different from the medieval versions, but the structural logic, the body has accumulated something harmful, let us help it get rid of that something, is not a medieval delusion. It is a genuine medical principle applied, in the medieval case, to the wrong substances through the wrong theoretical framework. One more intervention deserves space here, because it appears frequently enough in the historical record to be considered mainstream, and because it illustrates the creativity of medieval therapeutic thinking in a particularly vivid way. Cauterization, the application of heat to a wound or diseased area, either through a heated iron or through a caustic substance, was used both to stop bleeding and to treat a range of conditions including ulcers, infected wounds, and tumors. The heat was believed to drive out cold and moist corruption, to seal off the diseased tissue, to prevent the spread of putrefaction. It was agonizing. It was performed without anesthesia beyond whatever poppy preparation could be administered beforehand. And it was, in the specific case of wound management, sometimes genuinely effective. Heat does kill bacteria and tissue-destroying organisms, which medieval surgeons could not have known, but which their observations of cauterized wounds, healing more cleanly than non-cauterized ones, could have reinforced. Historians still argue about whether medieval surgery should be understood primarily as a mutilating last resort or as a genuinely skilled discipline with its own developing body of knowledge and technique. The truth seems to lie somewhere between those poles, varying enormously by practitioner, by region, and by period. The surgical manuals of the 13th and 14th centuries, texts by practitioners like Lanfranc of Milan, Henri de Mondeville, and Guy de Chauliac, describe surgical approaches of considerable sophistication for their time, including careful wound management, the importance of clean instruments, and attention to post-operative care that goes well beyond the crude hack-and-hope caricature. You are lying there with your arm bound after its encounter with the lancet, feeling simultaneously lighter and slightly dizzy. A combination your attending practitioner interprets as evidence that the excess humor has been successfully reduced. Whether this interpretation is correct is, frankly, beside the point right now. You are done being bled, at least for today. The bowl has been taken away. The herbs are working or not working in their quiet botanical way. And someone, probably the same person who brought your honey sage drink earlier, is suggesting that what you really need now is rest, warmth, and the attentions of someone who can offer what the physician and the barber surgeon cannot. What you need, in other words, is a different kind of care entirely. The kind that comes not from theory or technique, but from institution, community, and something that looks, in the firelight of the medieval world, very much like grace. Word count, 3098. Awaiting, continue. Section 6. There is a building at the edge of almost every medieval town of any significance, and you have probably walked past it without thinking too much about what happens inside. It sits near the church, or attached to it, or in its shadow, because in the medieval world, the proximity of healing to holiness is not metaphorical but architectural, built into the physical arrangement of the town the way a thesis is built into the opening paragraph of a sermon. The building is long and low, with high windows to let in light and air, a chapel at one end, and a smell that is, let us be honest, distinctive. It is the hospital, and it is not, in any meaningful sense, what the word hospital means to you today. The medieval hospital, the Hôtel Dieu in France, the Spital in German territories, the Domus Dei or House of God in Latin, was primarily an institution of Christian charity rather than a medical facility in the modern sense. This is not a criticism. It is a description of what it was and what it understood itself to be. Its founding purpose was the care of the poor, the sick, the pilgrim, the orphan, and the dying, the full spectrum of human vulnerability that Christian theology identified as the special concern of the faithful. The works of mercy that Christ enumerated in the Gospel of Matthew, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, clothing the naked, caring for the sick, visiting the imprisoned, were the operational charter of the medieval hospital, and the institution understood itself as performing those works on behalf of its founders, its donors, and the broader Christian community. This religious foundation shaped everything about the hospital experience. Its architecture, its daily rhythm, its staff, its atmosphere, and the nature of the care it provided. The hospital day was structured around the liturgical hours, the cycle of prayer that organized time in monastic and semi-monastic communities. Patients in the great medieval hospitals woke to the sound of bells, heard Mass in the chapel visible from their beds, received their meals at hours determined by religious rather than medical schedules, and were tended by staff whose primary qualification was religious vocation rather than medical training. The nursing care in most medieval hospitals was provided by religious women, sisters, nuns, lay sisters following a rule, whose dedication to the sick was understood as a form of worship, a direct service to Christ present in the suffering body of the patient. The physical layout of the great hospital wards reflected this integration of the sacred and the medical. The ideal arrangement, exemplified by the magnificent Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century and rebuilt and expanded repeatedly through the medieval period, placed the main ward as a long nave-like space with beds along the walls and down the center, oriented so that patients in their beds could see the altar at the end of the room. The chapel was not a separate facility you visited when you felt well enough. It was visible from where you lay, integrated into the daily visual and auditory experience of illness. You could hear the Mass being sung while you received your broth. You could see the elevation of the host from your pillow. The boundary between medical care and spiritual care was quite literally architectural, not a boundary at all, but a single continuous space. The beds in the great hospital wards were often shared. Multiple patients in a single bed was standard practice in many institutions, particularly when the hospital was crowded, which it frequently was. From a modern infection control perspective, this is alarming, and it almost certainly contributed to the spread of disease within hospital walls in ways that the medieval understanding of contagion could not have predicted or prevented. But within the medieval framework, the practice made a different kind of sense. The hospital bed was not primarily a medical instrument, a controlled, isolated environment for the treatment of a specific condition, but a place of rest and charity, and sharing it was an extension of the Christian community of care that the institution embodied. Separating patients by condition, isolating the infectious from the non-infectious, designing wards for specific disease categories. These are ideas that belong to a later medical epistemology, one that understands disease as a discrete biological entity that can spread between bodies through specific mechanisms. Medieval medicine understood illness as an individual humoral imbalance, not a transmissible agent, and the hospital's architecture reflected that understanding. There were exceptions to the general pattern, and they are worth noting because they point toward a genuine, if limited, empirical awareness of contagion that complicated the purely humoral framework. Leprosy hospitals, leprosaria or lazar houses, existed as separate institutions specifically designed to house lepers away from the general population, and their existence reflects a pragmatic recognition that leprosy spread in conditions of close contact, even if the theoretical explanation for why was articulated in terms of corrupted air and humoral corruption rather than bacterial transmission. By the time of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, as we will see shortly, quarantine measures of a recognizably modern character were being implemented in Italian cities, suggesting that empirical observation of disease transmission was generating practical public health responses that outran the theoretical framework's ability to explain them. The staff of the medieval hospital occupied a social and spiritual space quite different from the medical professionals we have already met. The master or warden of the hospital was typically a clergyman, responsible for the institution's religious life and administrative management. The nursing sisters, as noted, were religious women whose training was practical and devotional rather than theoretical. A physician might visit the hospital, a consulting role rather than a resident one, but the day-to-day medical management of patients was largely in the hands of people whose primary identity was religious rather than medical. This meant that the standard medical interventions of the period, the bloodletting, the herbal medicines, the dietary management, were applied within a framework of prayer, liturgy, and spiritual care that gave them a different character than the same interventions administered in a domestic setting. Prayers were prescribed as specifically as medicines. Particular saints were invoked for particular conditions, and the hospital's chapel would have housed relics or images of healing saints whose intercession was sought on behalf of the sick. Saint Cosmas and Saint Damian, the twin physician saints of the early Christian tradition, were the patron saints of medicine and surgery, and their images appear in hospitals and medical texts throughout the medieval period. Saint Roch was invoked against plague. Saint Apollonia, whose martyrdom had involved the extraction of her teeth, was the patron of dental pain, which suggests that even in the celestial economy, specialists were available. The list of saints with specific healing competencies was extensive and carefully maintained, because when your humoral imbalance has resisted the herbs and the bleeding, you want to be sure you are applying to the correct supernatural department. The role of the saint in medieval healing extends well beyond the hospital, of course, and reaches its most vivid expression in the practice of pilgrimage to healing shrines. The healing shrine was one of the most important medical institutions of the medieval world, not a peripheral or eccentric feature of religious life, but a central one, visited by people of every social class, integrated into the medical response to serious illness as naturally as the physician's visit or the apothecary's prescription. Major shrines, Canterbury, Compostela, Rome, Jerusalem, and dozens of regional and local ones, attracted thousands of pilgrims annually, many of them sick, many of them seeking cures that the available medical options had failed to provide. The theory of how shrine healing worked was theologically sophisticated. The saint, in Catholic theology, was not dead in the ordinary sense but alive in Christ, present in a uniquely powerful way at the location of their relics, their physical remains or objects they had touched or owned. The relic was not a magical object in the crude sense. It was a point of contact between the human and the divine, a site where the saint's continuing presence and intercession could be most powerfully accessed. To sleep near the relics, a practice called incubation, borrowed ultimately from ancient Greek healing temple traditions, was to place yourself in the saint's direct presence and to invite their healing attention. Many shrines collected accounts of miraculous cures, the Libri Miraculorum, the books of miracles, that served both as testimony to the saint's power and as encouragement to future pilgrims. These accounts, when examined carefully, are historically fascinating documents, describing conditions in enough detail to allow at least tentative modern diagnoses, recording the failure of conventional medicine before the miraculous cure, and situating the healing within the social and emotional context of the pilgrim's life. Historians still argue about how to interpret the healing shrine tradition, whether the cures reported in the miracle books reflect genuine medical phenomena, spontaneous remission, the powerful physiological effects of hope and belief, the rest and clean air of the journey itself, deliberate fabrication by shrine custodians seeking to enhance their institution's reputation, credulous misinterpretation of natural recovery, or some complex combination of all three. The honest answer is almost certainly that all of these were present in different proportions in different cases, and that the miracle book tradition is neither straightforwardly factual nor straightforwardly fictional but something more interesting than either, a record of how medieval people experienced and narrated the intersection of suffering, faith, and unexpected recovery. The pilgrimage journey itself had medical dimensions that were recognized at the time, even if not always in those terms. Walking long distances in the open air, getting out of the damp, smoky, crowded domestic environment where you had fallen ill, eating differently, drinking from springs and wells along the route, experiencing the social and emotional stimulation of travel and community with other pilgrims, arriving at a destination charged with hope and collective spiritual energy. All of these were genuine changes in the 6 non-naturals that the humoral framework considered medically significant. Air quality, exercise, emotional state, food and drink. A pilgrimage modified all of them simultaneously, and a learned physician prescribing for a patient whose domestic environment was contributing to their illness might genuinely recommend pilgrimage as a therapeutic intervention on these grounds, entirely separate from its spiritual dimensions. The hospital, then, and the shrine, and the saint, and the prayer, these were not the irrational alternatives to real medicine in the medieval world. They were part of the medical system, integrated into it, operating on the same patients in the same episodes of illness alongside the physician and the apothecary and the barber surgeon. The boundary between religious and medical care that seems obvious to the modern mind simply did not exist in the same way in a world where the body and the soul were understood as aspects of a single created being, where illness was simultaneously a humoral event and a spiritual one, and where the power that had made the body was the same power that could restore it. You are lying in your hospital bed, or perhaps you have been fortunate enough to remain in your own home, with the hospital's nursing sisters visiting, and the chapel bell is ringing the hour. Someone has brought you a bowl of pottage, thin and warm, easy on a stomach that has been through the evacuative adventures of the past day or two. A sister sits beside you, not speaking, just present. The simple, radical, medically underrated intervention of not being alone in your suffering. On the wall opposite your bed, a painted image of the Virgin looks toward you with an expression that medieval artists managed to make simultaneously formal and genuinely compassionate. A technical achievement in the visual representation of divine sympathy that took centuries to perfect. Outside the hospital walls, the town goes about its ordinary medieval business. The market, the workshop, the mill, the forge. But somewhere beyond the town, moving along the road with the particular slow urgency of people carrying a terrible thing with them, there is news coming. News of something larger than a single patient's humoral imbalance. News of something that will test every healer, every hospital, every shrine, every theory in the entire medical arsenal, and find them all, every one, devastatingly insufficient. The plague is coming, and nothing, not the herbs, not the bleeding, not the prayers, not the saints, is going to be enough. Word count, 3087. Awaiting, continue. Section 7. The news arrives before the dying does, which is almost worse. It travels the trade routes, the same roads and sea lanes that carry spices for the apothecary and exotic ingredients for the theriac. Arriving in rumor form first, fragmentary and terrible, reports from the east of a pestilence of extraordinary violence, cities emptied, populations halved, the dead piling faster than the living can bury them. By the time the plague itself reaches the ports of Sicily in October 1347, carried on Genoese trading ships whose crews were dying or already dead at their oars, the rumors have had months to breed anxiety into something close to dread. You are living through the arrival of what we now call the Black Death, and the word that keeps appearing in the chronicles and letters of the period, a word that translates roughly as stupor, as stunned incomprehension, captures something real about what it felt like to watch a catastrophe unfold that had no precedent in living memory and no adequate explanation in any available framework. The scale of the Black Death is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. Arriving in Europe in 1347 and spreading across the continent over the following 3 to 4 years, it killed somewhere between a third and a half of Europe's entire population. Estimates vary, and historians continue to debate both the total mortality and the precise mechanisms of the disease's spread. But the range of 30 to 60% population loss in affected regions represents a demographic catastrophe without parallel in recorded European history. Some regions lost more. Some communities were almost entirely wiped out. The villages whose populations simply vanished, the monasteries that lost every member, the cities where the dead lay in the streets because the living were too few and too frightened to remove them. These are not rhetorical exaggerations but documented realities, recorded by the survivors with the flat, exhausted precision of people who have moved past horror into something beyond it. You are in one of those cities, let us say a prosperous Italian port, since Italy was among the first and hardest hit, and since the Italian sources for this period are among the richest and most detailed. The spring of 1348. The plague has been in the city for weeks, and the rhythm of ordinary life has been disrupted in ways that seemed unimaginable 6 months ago. The markets are quieter, the churches are fuller, then suddenly emptier as the priests themselves begin to die. The bells that toll for the dead ring so constantly that some cities eventually order them silenced, because the sound of constant death bells is doing something to the survivors that goes beyond grief into a kind of psychological unraveling. What the plague actually was, its biological identity, its mechanism, its transmission, is something that medieval medicine was completely unequipped to understand. The dominant explanation among learned physicians was miasmatic. The plague was caused by corrupted air, poisoned by the conjunction of malign planetary influences, specifically the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius that had occurred in 1345 and was identified by the medical faculty of the University of Paris, in a formal report commissioned by the French king, as the astrological origin of the pestilence. The corrupted air entered the body through breathing, through the pores of the skin, through the eyes, which is why some plague physicians wore the famous beak-shaped mask stuffed with aromatic herbs, an attempt to filter and purify the miasmatic air before it reached the lungs. The herbs in the beak were not entirely useless. Some had genuine antimicrobial properties, and the mask itself provided a physical barrier, but they were designed to address the wrong mechanism, and against Yersinia pestis transmitted by flea bite, aromatic herbs in a beak mask were reassuring rather than protective. The symptoms of bubonic plague are among the most vivid and horrible in the history of disease, and they are described in the medieval sources with a directness that reflects both the writer's documentary impulse and the fact that by 1348 almost everyone had seen them close up. The buboes, the swollen, blackened lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, or neck that gave the disease one of its names, appeared within days of infection, growing rapidly to the size of an egg or an apple, excruciatingly painful, sometimes bursting and draining, sometimes hardening without resolution. Accompanying them were fever, delirium, the characteristic dark blotches on the skin from subcutaneous bleeding that gave the Black Death its modern name, and a smell that contemporaries described with a consistency suggesting it was genuinely distinctive, sweet, putrid, the smell of something corrupting from within. Death, when it came, typically came within 3 to 7 days of the first symptoms. In the pneumonic form of the disease, spread person to person through respiratory droplets, death came faster still, within 1 to 3 days, with a near-certain mortality rate that made the bubonic form look almost survivable by comparison. The medical response to the Black Death was, by any honest assessment, almost entirely ineffective. This is not a criticism of the physicians and surgeons who tried. Many of them died trying, because treating plague patients in an era without understanding of disease transmission meant exposing yourself to the same fleas, the same infected air, the same proximity to dying bodies that was killing everyone else. The courage required to continue treating patients when you had watched your colleagues die of the same disease you were treating was real, and many physicians and clergy and nursing sisters demonstrated it. But courage and the wrong theory in the face of Yersinia pestis produced the same outcome as cowardice. It just produced it more heroically. Bloodletting was tried. Of course it was the dominant intervention for serious illness, and the plague presented as a serious illness. The buboes were lanced, sometimes producing dramatic quantities of infected material and occasionally, in a small number of cases, providing some relief, not because lancing addressed the underlying infection, but because a bubo that drained sometimes resolved more successfully than one that did not, and the body's own immune response occasionally managed to contain the infection once the pressure was released. This limited, accidental efficacy was noted and recorded, contributing to lancing as a recommended treatment even as its overall impact on survival rates was minimal. Fumigation, burning aromatic woods, herbs, and substances in the streets and houses was one of the most widely implemented public health responses, directed at purifying the corrupted air. Bonfires burned in city squares. People carried small pomanders, balls of aromatic substances, before their faces. Windows were kept closed in some theories, open in others, depending on whether the local air was considered more or less corrupted than the indoor air, a question to which nobody had a reliable answer. Some physicians recommended flight as the most effective intervention. Get out of the affected area as fast as possible, travel far, and stay away until the pestilence had passed. This advice, rendered in the Latin formula cito, lunge, tard, leave quickly, go far, return late, was the most practically effective guidance the medical tradition offered, not because it addressed the disease but because it reduced exposure. Unfortunately, flight by infected people also carried the plague to new locations, making the advice simultaneously individually sensible and collectively catastrophic. The public health measures that emerged in response to the Black Death in Italian cities represent one of the most significant developments in the history of medicine, because they mark the beginning of organized, state-level epidemic management that did not depend on humoral theory. Venice established a system of maritime quarantine, requiring ships arriving from infected ports to anchor offshore for a period of 30 days, later extended to 40 days, before their crews and cargo were allowed to land. The 40-day period gave the practice its name, quarantino, from quaranta, 40. The theoretical justification for quarantine was not quite modern. It was articulated partly in miasmatic terms, the idea that the ship's corrupted atmosphere needed time to clear, but the practical mechanism was correct. isolating potentially infected individuals for long enough that the disease would either manifest or not, before allowing contact with the uninfected population, is sound epidemiological practice, and the Italian cities that implemented it did reduce their mortality compared to cities that did not. The social fabric of communities under plague stress tore in ways that the chronicles record with varying degrees of horror and sad recognition. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing his Decameron in the immediate aftermath of the 1348 plague in Florence, describes the abandonment of the sick by their families, neighbors, and friends with a specificity that suggests personal witness. People dying alone, untended, because those who might have cared for them had fled or were themselves dying or were simply paralyzed by a fear so rational and so overwhelming that the normal bonds of human obligation could not hold against it. Parents abandoned children. Children abandoned parents. The clergy, whose duty was to administer last rites to the dying, fled or died in such numbers that many plague victims died without the sacraments that medieval theology considered essential to a good death, a spiritual catastrophe layered on top of the physical one. The psychological and spiritual crisis of the Black Death was, for contemporaries, as profound as the demographic one. How could God permit this? What sin had been committed on a scale sufficient to merit this punishment? The flagellant movement. Groups of men who processed through towns publicly whipping themselves in acts of extreme penitential suffering, attempting to atone collectively for whatever collective sin had brought the plague. Spread rapidly through parts of Germany and the Low Countries, a mass expression of the terrifying logic that if illness was divine punishment, then perhaps sufficiently extreme penitence might move God to mercy. The Church, initially tolerant, eventually condemned the flagellants as heretical, not least because their theology implied that self-inflicted suffering could substitute for priestly sacraments, which was doctrinally dangerous. But the movement's rapid spread tells you something real about the spiritual desperation of communities watching their world dissolve. The persecution of Jewish communities represents the darkest social response to the Black Death, and it must be named directly even in a gentle bedtime narrative, because it was real and it was devastating. In dozens of cities across Germany, France, and the Iberian Peninsula, Jewish communities were accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells, an accusation without any factual basis, driven by existing anti-Semitism, economic resentment, and the desperate human need to find an agent responsible for an incomprehensible catastrophe. Massacres followed, in some cases before the plague had even arrived in the accuser's own cities. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull explicitly defending Jewish communities and pointing out that Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as everyone else, which was true, and which should have been dispositive, and which was largely ignored by the mobs carrying out the violence. The Black Death killed indiscriminately. The persecution it generated did not. The quirky detail that emerges from the plague's medical history, strange enough to stick in the mind amid so much darkness, is that some people did survive, and their survival generated intense medical interest in what distinguished them from those who died. Physicians noted that certain individuals seemed constitutionally resistant, their humoral balance apparently sufficient to withstand the assault of the corrupted air. Certain occupations seemed more or less vulnerable. Certain dietary habits seemed to correlate with survival. Much of this analysis was post hoc rationalization, pattern-seeking in the noise of mass mortality, but it drove a genuine accumulation of observational data about the disease's behavior that would inform plague medicine for the next 3 centuries. The plague returned repeatedly in waves throughout the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, and each recurrence added to the empirical record, slowly building, however incorrectly theorized, toward an understanding of epidemic disease that would eventually make quarantine and isolation standard public health practice. After the worst had passed, after the plague had moved on, or exhausted its supply of susceptible hosts, or simply abated for reasons that were as mysterious as its arrival, the survivors emerged into a world that was demonstrably, permanently different. Land was available because so many who had worked it were dead. Labor was scarce and therefore more valuable. The Church's authority was complicated by its manifest inability to protect its own clergy, let alone its congregation. The medical profession's reputation was damaged but not destroyed. The physicians who had fled were criticized. Those who had stayed were celebrated, and the overall failure of medicine to stop the plague generated not a wholesale rejection of the humoral tradition but a complex reassessment of its limits and a renewed urgency around its further development. You have survived. Not everyone around you has. The town you live in is quieter than it was a year ago. Not peacefully quieter, but emptied quiet, the kind of silence that has a shape defined by all the voices no longer filling it. You are still sick, or perhaps you have recovered, or perhaps you are one of the fortunate ones who never caught it, standing in the strange survivor space of not knowing why you were spared. The hospital at the edge of town has been overwhelmed and is now slowly returning to something like normal operation. The apothecaries are restocking their depleted supplies. The barber surgeons are busy with the aftermath, not plague itself now, but the other conditions that accumulate when medical attention has been focused elsewhere for months. And you, in your bed, in your house, in your recovering town, you are thinking about what comes next. About what it means to be sick in a world that has just demonstrated, with brutal clarity, the limits of everything anyone thought they knew about disease. About the long, slow, unglamorous business of getting better. About what your daily life actually looks like when the acute crisis has passed and you are left with the ordinary, grinding, intimate experience of illness working its way through your body day by day. That is where we are going now. Back to the bedside. Back to the small, human scale of a single person, sick, in need of care, navigating the long journey from illness toward something that might, eventually, be called recovery. Word count, 3,102. Awaiting, continue. Section 8. The crisis has passed, or at least it has passed its most dramatic phase. The fever has broken, or the bubo has drained, or the physician has declared, with the cautious optimism of someone who has seen too many recoveries reverse themselves to commit fully to good news, that you appear to be improving. You are not well. You are very far from well. But you are, in the careful medieval phrasing, on the mend. A phrase that implies not a switch being flipped but a slow, incremental process of restoration, like a torn piece of cloth being worked back together one careful stitch at a time. And that process, the long, ordinary middle of medieval illness, the days and weeks of being bedridden and dependent and slowly, haltingly better, is what we are going to inhabit now, because it is where most of the actual experience of medieval sickness lived. Your bed is the center of your world. This is not a metaphor, it is a literal description of your spatial reality for as long as your illness persists. The medieval bed was not the simple, standardized piece of furniture we might imagine. For the wealthy, it was one of the most significant and expensive objects in the household. A substantial wooden frame with a rope or leather webbing base, a straw or feather mattress, linen sheets, wool blankets, fur coverlets in winter, and curtains on all four sides that could be drawn to create a small, private, climate-controlled environment within the larger room. The bed curtains served multiple practical functions. They kept out drafts in rooms that were, by any modern standard, extraordinarily porous to cold air. They provided a degree of privacy in households where multiple people often shared sleeping spaces, and they created a psychological boundary between the sick person's immediate environment and the rest of the domestic world. When the curtains were drawn, you were in your own space. When they were opened, you were available to the world again. For the poor, the bed was considerably less elaborate. A straw pallet on the floor or on a simple wooden frame, a rough blanket, perhaps a shared space with other family members or even with animals in the coldest weather, since the body heat of livestock was a genuine heating resource in the pre-central heating world. The quality of your bed during illness was, like the quality of your medical care, a direct function of your economic position, and the difference between being sick in a wealthy household with its fur-covered, curtained bed in a room with a dedicated hearth, and being sick in a peasant hovel on a straw pallet with a smoky central fire and drafts coming through the gaps in the wattle and daub. That difference was not merely a matter of comfort. It was a matter of survival probability, because warmth, rest, and adequate nutrition are genuine factors in recovery, and poverty made all three harder to maintain. The room in which you are sick matters too, and medieval domestic architecture was not designed with the bedridden in mind. In wealthier households, the solar, the private upper room, often south-facing to maximize light, was the preferred location for a sick person's bed, and the light and relative warmth it offered were considered genuinely therapeutic. In humoral terms, good air quality was one of the 6 non-naturals, and a sick room with decent ventilation and natural light was understood to support recovery in a direct medical sense. The physician might give specific instructions about the sick room, windows to be opened at certain times of day, others to be kept closed, aromatic substances to be burned to purify the air, specific directions for the bed's orientation. The management of the sick room environment was a medical act, not merely a domestic one. Who is with you in that room is a question with a complex and touching answer. Medieval illness was, at virtually every social level, a communal rather than a private experience. The isolation of the sick person, quarantine in the modern public health sense, or the contemporary practice of restricting hospital visitors to maintain a sterile environment, was not a feature of ordinary medieval illness management. When you were sick, people came. Neighbors visited. Family members reorganized their lives around your care. The priest came, sometimes more than once, to administer sacraments and to pray with you. Friends sat with you, talked with you, brought you things, monitored your progress, and reported it to others. The sick person was embedded in a social web of care and attention that, whatever its epidemiological disadvantages, provided something that modern medicine has only recently begun to systematically study and validate: the profound, physiologically real benefit of social connection and human presence in illness. The caretaking fell, in most medieval households, primarily to women. This was not merely cultural assumption but reflected the practical reality that women's domestic labor already included the preparation of food, the management of the household's physical environment, and the care of children, all of which overlapped substantially with the care of the sick. A woman managing a sick household member was deploying skills and knowledge she had already developed in the ordinary course of domestic life, supplemented by whatever specific medical knowledge she had accumulated through experience, community knowledge sharing, and the traditions passed down through female networks of practical learning. She knew which herbs were in the garden. She knew how to make a broth that an invalid could keep down. She knew how to change a dressing, how to sponge down a feverish body, how to manage the small, intimate indignities of serious illness with the matter-of-fact competence that comes from having done it before. The food you ate during illness was prescribed as carefully as any medicine, and the sick diet of medieval Europe had its own logic, its own repertoire, and its own, occasionally appealing, actual contents. The guiding principle was digestibility. A sick body, in humoral theory, had compromised digestive capacity, since digestion was understood as a form of internal heating and cooking, and a body whose vital heat was depleted by illness could not be expected to process the same foods that a healthy body managed easily. The sick diet was therefore light, warm, and easily digestible, designed not to tax the body's already strained resources but to nourish it gently while it worked on recovery. Pottage, a thin, soupy dish made from grain, vegetables, and sometimes small amounts of meat, cooked long and gently until everything had softened into near-liquid form, was the staple of the sick diet across most social levels. It was cheap enough for the poor, adaptable enough for the wealthy, and genuinely nourishing in a mild, undemanding way. The grain provided carbohydrates for energy. The long cooking released nutrients into the liquid. The warmth addressed the humoral requirement for heating. It was, in short, the medieval equivalent of chicken soup, not because it cured anything specifically, but because it sustained the body without overtaxing it while the body's own resources addressed the underlying problem. For the wealthy sick, the diet expanded considerably. Almond milk, made by grinding almonds and steeping them in water, then straining, was considered ideal for invalids, nourishing, warming, gentle on a compromised stomach, and carrying none of the risks associated with cow's milk, which was considered potentially cold and difficult to digest in a weakened system. Chicken broth, as we noted earlier, was practically a medical prescription. Poached eggs were approved for their easy digestibility. White bread, the more refined and expensive sort, made from sifted flour, was preferred to dark bread during illness, on the grounds that its greater refinement made it lighter and easier for the depleted digestive system to process. This preference for refined white bread over coarse whole grain during illness is another of those points where humoral theory and modern nutritional understanding part ways fairly sharply. We now know that whole grain is generally nutritionally superior, but the emphasis on easily digestible food for acutely ill patients is not wrong in principle. and the specific recommendations made for sick people often prioritized foods that were genuinely gentle on inflamed or impaired digestive systems. Wine remained part of the sick diet, typically in small amounts and often diluted with water, on the grounds that its warming quality supported digestion and its antiseptic properties. Not that anyone called them that, protected against corruption in the gut. Spiced wines, warmed and sweetened, were particularly favored for invalids, the spices providing additional warming quality, the sweetness making the medicine more palatable, the warmth addressing the cold-moist imbalance that illness so often represented. There is something undeniably appealing about a medical system that prescribes warm spiced wine for the bedridden, and if you are going to be wrong about the mechanism, that is, at minimum, a pleasant way to be wrong. Water was still viewed with suspicion, as we have noted, but during illness fresh spring water was sometimes recommended, particularly in cases where excess heat was the problem, where a moderately cooling drink was therapeutically indicated. The physician's prescription was specific. This kind of water from this kind of source, in this amount, at this time of day, warmed or cooled to this degree. The management of fluid intake during illness was a genuine medical concern, and the recognition that what you drank mattered to recovery was correct, even if the specific prescriptions were sometimes counterproductive. Sleep occupied a central and carefully theorized place in the sick person's management. Sleep was one of the 6 non-naturals, and its role in recovery was explicitly and repeatedly emphasized in the medical literature. During sleep, the body's digestive and restorative processes were believed to work most efficiently. The vital heat concentrated inward, the humors settling and processing, the evacuations of illness doing their work without the interference of waking activity. A good night's sleep was, in quite literal humoral terms, a therapeutic event. The physician who prescribed sleep for a sick patient, who instructed the household to keep the room quiet, to allow the patient to rest without interruption, to manage light and noise and visitors around the sleep schedule, was giving advice that modern sleep science would largely endorse, again for completely different reasons. The quality of medieval sleep was complicated by the pain and discomfort of illness itself, by the shared sleeping arrangements of many households, by the noise and light management challenges of medieval domestic environments, and by the emotional weight of serious illness, the fear, the uncertainty, the awareness of mortality that a serious medieval illness inevitably carried. The physician might prescribe medicines to promote sleep, preparations containing opium poppy, henbane, or mandrake, singly or in combination, that had genuine sedative properties. The soporific sponge, a piece of material soaked in a preparation of these substances and held near the patient's nose, was used in surgical contexts to produce something approaching unconsciousness, and lighter preparations of the same ingredients were available for sleep induction in medical contexts. The dosing was imprecise by any standard we would now consider acceptable, ranging from ineffective to dangerously overdosed, but the intent, to manage pain and promote restorative sleep in a seriously ill patient, was sound. The emotional experience of being sick in medieval times is harder to reconstruct than the physical one, but the sources give us enough to work with. The letters, wills, prayers, and devotional texts of the period reveal people who were frightened, genuinely rationally frightened by serious illness, who grieved for their lost capacity and their disrupted lives, who worried about their families, their unfinished business, their spiritual state, and their mortality. The medieval sick person was aware, in a way that might be uncomfortable for modern sensibilities, that illness could be fatal with a speed and frequency that our medical culture has largely domesticated. This awareness gave medieval illness a particular emotional texture, an urgency, a seriousness, a tendency to produce what we might call existential clarity, the kind that comes from lying in a curtained bed wondering whether you are going to die, and deciding, in that honesty, what actually matters to you. The will-making that often accompanied serious illness in the medieval period was not merely a legal formality but an emotional and spiritual act, an opportunity to settle accounts, literal and figurative, to make peace with people you had wronged or who had wronged you, to distribute your goods in ways that reflected your values, to ensure that masses would be said for your soul and the poor would be remembered in your giving. Being sick, in other words, was also an occasion for being human in some of the most fundamental ways, confronting your mortality, attending to your relationships, considering what you were leaving behind. Recovery, when it came, was gradual, monitored, and carefully managed. The convalescent was not simply released from the sickbed back to normal life once the acute symptoms resolved. The physician prescribed a graduated return. First sitting up, then standing, then short walks within the house, then cautious ventures outside, each stage contingent on continued improvement, each managed with dietary adjustments to match the body's returning strength. The convalescent diet moved incrementally from the invalid's thin pottage toward more substantial foods as digestive capacity returned, from almond milk toward ordinary food, from bed rest toward gentle exercise, from the protected environment of the sick room toward the ordinary sensory world outside it. One of the quirky details that the convalescence literature throws up is the consistent emphasis on the dangers of premature return to normal activity. The idea that a person who felt better was not necessarily better, that the humoral restoration might appear complete while still being fragile, and that a relapse caused by overexertion or dietary indiscretion was worse than the original illness because it depleted the body's resources twice. This caution about relapse was sometimes expressed in almost parental tones by the medical texts, warning the newly recovered against the temptation to eat and drink and exercise freely just because they felt capable of it. The medieval convalescent was, in the physician's imagination, somewhat like a recovering alcoholic in a room full of spiced wine, technically capable of restraint, but requiring structure and supervision to maintain it. Scars, if you had them from buboes or surgical incisions or cauterization, were worn as physical records of survival. The body that emerged from serious medieval illness was often different from the one that had entered it. Thinner, slower, marked, carrying the physical memory of what it had been through in ways that could not be entirely concealed or ignored. But it was alive. Alive in the medieval world with all that implied. The scratchy linen, the smoky fire, the thin pottage, the physician's watchful eye, the saint's image on the wall, the bells marking the hours of a day that you are, against considerable odds, still present to experience. Outside, the world is carrying on with its various medieval urgencies. But in here, in this curtained, fire-lit space that has been the whole of your world for days or weeks, something is shifting. The broth tastes better than it did yesterday. Your eyes are less heavy. The ache in your joints has moved from sharp to dull, which is, in its quiet way, a form of progress. You are, it appears, going to make it. Word count, 3098. Awaiting, continue. Section 9. You are going to make it. And as you lie there in the improving light of your convalescence, the curtains of your bed drawn back a little further each morning to let in more of the world, it seems like a reasonable moment to take stock. Not just of your own recovery, but of the whole extraordinary system that surrounded your illness, the physicians and barber surgeons, the apothecaries and wise women, the bleeding bowls and herbal decoctions, the hospital chapel and the healing shrine, the humoral theory that structured every diagnosis and every treatment and every anxious calculation of which vein to open at which phase of the moon. What do we actually make of it all, now that we can look back from the far side of both your fever and 7 centuries of subsequent medical history? The easy answer, the one that requires the least effort and produces the most comfortable sense of modern superiority, is that medieval medicine was simply wrong. That it was a collection of mistakes dressed in impressive Latin, a system of confident errors that killed more patients than it saved, a historical curiosity to be viewed from a safe distance with a mixture of pity and mild horror. This answer is not entirely false. Medieval medicine did make serious, consequential errors. People died of treatments that made their underlying conditions worse. The theoretical framework was built on foundations that were, at the cellular and molecular level, completely incorrect. The elegant logical chain from humoral diagnosis to evacuative treatment led, in enough cases, to outcomes that a watchful non-intervention would have bettered. None of this is deniable, and in the honest assessment of any medical tradition, its failures must be counted alongside its successes. But the easy answer is also, as easy answers tend to be, significantly incomplete. And the more interesting, more honest, more genuinely illuminating answer requires sitting with the complexity a little longer. Asking not merely what medieval medicine got wrong, but what it got right, what it got accidentally right, what it preserved and transmitted that would eventually bear fruit in later centuries, and what it reveals about the deep, persistent structure of the human attempt to understand and manage disease. Let us start with what medieval medicine genuinely got right, in the sense of producing recommendations that we would recognize today as beneficial. The emphasis on the 6 non-naturals, air, food and drink, sleep, exercise, emotional state, and evacuation, as central determinants of health is, stripped of its humoral theoretical dressing, a remarkably comprehensive model of lifestyle medicine. Modern epidemiology has spent the last several decades painstakingly documenting, with large cohort studies and randomized controlled trials and sophisticated statistical methods, exactly what Galen and his medieval successors asserted on theoretical grounds, that what you eat, how much you sleep, how much you exercise, the quality of the air you breathe, and the state of your emotional life are primary determinants of health and disease. The mechanisms are completely different from what medieval physicians imagined, but the variables identified are correct. Dietary medicine, the use of food as medicine, the management of what a patient ate as a central therapeutic intervention, is another area where medieval practice, for the wrong reasons, anticipated conclusions that modern nutritional medicine is still working toward. The emphasis on easily digestible food for the acutely ill, the recognition that different constitutions and different conditions require different dietary approaches, the attention to food quality and preparation method as medically relevant, these are not primitive notions. They are genuine medical insights, arrived at through 1,000 years of observing which patients seem to do better under which dietary conditions, and filtered through a theoretical framework that, however wrong its underlying chemistry, was sufficiently sensitive to pattern that it captured real regularities. The herbal tradition preserved genuine pharmacological knowledge across centuries in which that knowledge might otherwise have been lost. We have already noted willow bark and its salicin content, garlic and its allicin-derived antimicrobial properties, opium poppy and its genuine analgesic activity. The list extends considerably further. Artemisia wormwood was used in medieval medicine for parasitic infections of the gut, and artemisinin, derived from a related species, is now the most effective treatment for malaria in the world. Colchicine, derived from autumn crocus, was used in medieval medicine for joint pain and swelling, and is still used today for gout and certain inflammatory conditions. Digitalis from foxglove, as noted, is still the basis of important cardiac medications. The medieval herbalist was working without any understanding of receptor pharmacology or drug metabolism, navigating by humoral theory and empirical observation, and yet the accumulated practical knowledge of which plants affected which symptoms, knowledge built up over centuries of use and refined through generations of observational feedback, contained within it a genuine pharmacological library that modern drug discovery has been mining with considerable profit. Surgery, perhaps surprisingly, is an area where medieval practitioners developed genuinely impressive practical skills. The surgical manuals of the 13th and 14th centuries describe techniques for wound management, fracture reduction, hernia repair, cataract couching, and the removal of bladder stones that demonstrate careful anatomical observation and accumulated procedural knowledge. The English surgeon John of Ardern, working in the 14th century, described a procedure for anal fistula repair that remained the standard approach for centuries and is recognizably related to techniques still used today. Medieval surgeons could not prevent infection. They had no concept of surgical antisepsis, and the mortality from post-operative wound infection was catastrophic by modern standards. But they could, with skill and speed, perform procedures that were genuinely corrective, and the best of them had developed an understanding of surgical anatomy and technique that represents a genuine intellectual and practical achievement. The hospital tradition, for all that it operated on religious rather than medical principles, preserved and transmitted something of enormous long-term importance. The idea that society has an obligation to provide care for its sick members regardless of their ability to pay. The medieval hospital was not a good hospital by modern standards. Its infection control was non-existent. Its medical interventions were limited, its primary function was comfort and spiritual care rather than cure. But its existence established an institutional precedent, and the tradition of the hospital as a site of communal obligation toward the sick is the direct ancestor of every public hospital, every national health service, every emergency room required by law to treat patients regardless of their insurance status. The theological framework that generated medieval hospitals, the sick person as Christ, the caregiver as performing a sacred act, has been replaced by secular frameworks of human rights and social solidarity, but the institutional structure it created has proven extraordinarily durable. The attention to patient experience, to the sick person as a whole human being with emotional, spiritual, and social needs as well as physical ones, is another area where medieval medicine had instincts that modern medicine has sometimes lost and is currently working to recover. The physician who asked about your emotional state, the nursing sister who sat with you in the night, the community that reorganized itself around your illness, the framework that treated your fear and grief as medically relevant. All of these represent a holistic approach to the sick person that contemporary medicine, increasingly aware of the evidence base for patient-centered care, psychosocial support, and the therapeutic value of human connection, is attempting to systematize and scale. The medieval approach was not systematic. It was not evidence-based in any modern sense. But it was oriented toward the whole person in a way that purely biomedical approaches are not, and the rediscovery of that orientation in modern medicine is one of the more interesting recursive loops in the long history of healing. Historians still argue about the question of how much continuity there was between medieval medicine and the scientific revolution in medicine that began in the 16th and 17th centuries, whether the medieval tradition was primarily an obstacle that had to be overcome before real progress could begin, or whether it preserved and transmitted knowledge and institutional structures that made later progress possible. The argument is genuine and unresolved, because both things are true to different degrees in different domains. Humoral theory was an obstacle. Vesalius could not have developed his revolutionary anatomy of the human body without breaking with Galen, and Harvey could not have described the circulation of the blood without contradicting the entire Galenic understanding of how blood moved through the body. In those senses, medieval medicine had to be dismantled before modern medicine could be built. But the dismantling was not a clean break. It was a long, uneven, geographically variable process in which elements of the medieval tradition persisted long after the theoretical framework that justified them had been replaced. Bloodletting continued to be practiced in educated Western medicine well into the 19th century, killing, most infamously, George Washington, who was bled so aggressively in the treatment of what was probably acute epiglottitis that the treatment almost certainly hastened his death. The herbal tradition was not abandoned with the humoral theory but continued, gradually transformed, as the active constituents of medicinal plants were isolated and their mechanisms elucidated. The hospital, founded in religious charity, survived the secularization of European society and became the central institution of modern medical care. The question of what medieval people themselves understood about the limits of their medicine is one that the sources raise in interesting ways. Medieval physicians were not naive about failure. They observed that their treatments did not always work. They debated the ethics of treating patients whom they considered unlikely to survive. Some argued that attempting treatment in hopeless cases was a kindness, others that it was a deception that burdened the patient and family with false hope and unnecessary expense. They grappled, in their own theoretical language, with the difference between conditions that were in principle treatable and those that were not, with the question of when the physician's art reached its limits and the patient's fate passed into God's hands. These are not merely medieval questions. They are the same questions that medical ethics committees, palliative care physicians, and oncologists are wrestling with today, in different theoretical languages but with the same underlying human weight. The peculiar detail that stays with you, as you think back over the whole medieval medical world we have been inhabiting tonight, is this: in 1363, a French surgeon named Guy de Chauliac, who had lived through the Black Death and treated its victims and written about it with extraordinary clinical precision, produced a comprehensive surgical text called the Chirurgia Magna, the Great Surgery, that remained a standard reference in European medicine for nearly 2 centuries. In it, he criticized physicians who fled during the plague rather than treating patients, described his own illness and recovery from plague in clinical detail, discussed the limits of available treatments with unusual honesty, and repeatedly emphasized the importance of careful observation over blind adherence to textual authority. He was, in other words, doing something recognizably scientific, privileging empirical observation, acknowledging uncertainty, criticizing credulous reliance on received wisdom, within a theoretical framework that was still fundamentally Galenic. He was medieval and proto-modern simultaneously, which is perhaps the most accurate description of medieval medicine as a whole. You are still in your bed, but the curtains are fully open now, and the light coming through the window is the particular quality of light that seems to arrive specifically when you are getting better from something, brighter than you remembered, more detailed, more generous. The fire has burned down to embers that glow rather than flame. The bowl that held your thin pottage is empty, and you are, for the first time in days, thinking about something other than how your body feels. The physician will come tomorrow, probably to assess your progress, to check your pulse and perhaps examine your urine one more time, to adjust the dietary prescription for the next stage of your convalescence. The barber surgeon's lancet is, for the moment, put away. The herbs have done what herbs can do. You are alive in the medieval world, and that is not a small thing. And now, let the story begin to soften at its edges. The way a fire softens when the last log has caught and the room settles into its warmest, quietest hour. You have traveled a long way tonight, through the humoral theory and the healer's crowded marketplace, through the physician's careful diagnostic gaze and the apothecary's fragrant shop, through the bleeding bowl and the herbal remedy and the hospital ward with its chapel at the end. You have survived the plague, or at least witnessed it, and found your way back to the simple, profound fact of a body recovering in a bed. Let that image rest with you now. The curtained bed, the warm broth, the saint's image on the wall, quiet and patient in the firelight. The bells marking an hour you are still here to hear. Medieval people were not so different from you, lying there in the dark, hoping to feel better tomorrow. They were frightened and hopeful and sometimes brave and sometimes not. They reached for what they had. The herb from the garden, the physician's learning, the prayer at the shrine, the hand of the person sitting beside them, and they held on. Most of them, most of the time, in ways that still echo across the centuries, managed to hold on. Your breath is slower now. The story is settling around you like a warm blanket, like the fur coverlet on the medieval bed, like the quiet that comes after the bells have stopped and the fire has found its rhythm and the night has nothing left to prove. Sleep now. You are warm. You are safe. You are, unlike the medieval patient we have been following all evening, very well looked after indeed. Sweet dreams. Word count, 3076. End of script. Sweet dreams.